Good morning. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the American Institute of Architects and congratulate you for taking part in the 2030 district and helping to obtain our collective goals of energy efficiency and sustainability. Here we go. I've personally been very interested in energy conservation and efficiency since I was a child, arguing with my father, who was a nuclear physicist, over the subjects of nuclear power and war. After graduating from college, I spent the following 15 years actively organizing against the nuclear power industry and for a more sustainable future. That eventually led me to Chernobyl to witness the ecological disaster continuing to unfold there. Time will tell if my work to establish a state-recognized Green Party in Ohio and a national Green Party in the United States was well spent or not. It seemed imperative to me at the time. The fact that we seem to finally be developing widespread strategies at making our built environment more energy efficient is a very good sign. If our political system was more responsible to us, the natural persons, we would have been at this point decades ago. It's hard now for me to watch the nightly news and see the policies and administrative bureaucracies upon which the little we have accomplished rests be degraded and threatened with terminating budget cuts, as though the quality of our future did not at least partly depend upon the sustenance of the EPA, the Department of Energy, and so on. Be all that as it may, we're here this morning to talk about the close relationship that historic preservation has with sustainability and the efficiency of the built environment. The word, sustainability, encompassing the concept that activities be conducted in a way that allows their continuation for the foreseeable future, is thrown around as though walking to a nearby restaurant, driving one's car a little less, or switching to energy-conserving light bulbs fulfills the requirements of a system in a stable state. While energy conservation and efficiency is a big part of a sustainable future, and we can quantify the embodied energy in buildings and building materials, the basic fact is that the greenest building is the one that's already built. How do we refine our understanding of sustainability so that it refers to more than energy conservation and lower carbon emissions? Sustainability in its broader, more complete meaning includes the preservation and improvement of the attributes of our civil society in both its governmental and non-governmental forms, the development and implementation of scientifically based public policies, and the protection of fragile assets like air, water, our food supply, cultural memory, and the capital investments of previous generations, including older buildings. Historic preservation has to be a central element of an overall strategy aimed at creating a more sustainable environment. Historic buildings already have many attributes that make them function more sustainably and efficiently than many newer buildings. Some of these features are shared walls that reduce heat loss between buildings, skylights, light wells, and transoms or borrowed light openings that provide natural lighting and sometimes ventilation to the interior of a building, and taller, operable windows and higher ceilings that provide direct and reflected light deeper into the building. Frequently, awnings on older buildings shade these larger windows from excessive heat gain in the summer months and provide shelter to the pedestrian environment of the sidewalk. Recessed entryways can provide a buffer from wind entering a building where a vestibule is not present. Storefront bulkhead windows allow light and ventilation into basements, and ceiling fans can circulate both hotter and cooler air depending on the season, taking a load off air handlers and HVAC systems. This infrared image of part of a building exterior illustrates how a building envelope of an historic building is an important feature where energy efficiency can usually be improved. Caulking, sealing, and weather stripping the seams, cracks, and openings is usually a first step. Adding insulation below the first floor and above the uppermost ceiling is another cost-effective way to make historic buildings more comfortable and energy efficient. Building envelope modifications, such as roof, window, and door replacement and exterior wall insulation can be done, but can easily cause both damage to the historic character of the building or unexpected condensation, rot, rust, or other moisture-related problems like insect, mold, or fungus infestations. It is smart to hire a professional to help with these sorts of modifications to avoid getting into trouble or destroying irreplaceable architectural details in historic fabric. Lastly, the improvement of the efficiency of heating and cooling equipment, high-efficiency boilers, furnaces, and air conditioning units, along with point-of-use and on-demand hot water heaters, as well as energy-efficient appliances and office equipment, can reduce overall energy requirements and reduce emissions. Altering the sources of energy is also sometimes an option with an older property. This would entail the addition of solar panels or compact windmills, or maybe even the installation of geothermal heat sources. There's an excellent technical brief on this subject available from the National Park Service. If you want help finding that online, see me afterwards. Alongside these attributes of historic buildings and strategies for improvement for their energy performance, let's talk a little bit about the other aspects of sustainability that are related to historic preservation. Preservation contributes to the environmental and economic health and vitality of a place in a variety of ways. It is well documented that designation of historic districts tends to cause an improvement in individual property values, and such designation can protect existing rental space from being demolished. Preservation conserves resources and the embodied energy that is invested in an existing building or place. It also preserves the cultural memory of craftsmanship, design ideology, and social history. Investment in the rehabilitation and restoration of old buildings even produces more local economic activity than the construction of new buildings, because a greater percentage of the investment tends to be in local labor rather than imported materials. Perhaps most importantly, the preservation of old buildings allows and fosters the essential development of new work, as evidenced in the form of smaller startup businesses and new enterprises because of the lower cost of rent. The types of innovative, experimental entrepreneurism that is a fundamental part of an economy with the potential to grow and become more vibrant and dynamic is dependent upon the availability of lower-cost, older buildings. This was certainly the case for Cleveland Public Theater, which operated on a shoestring budget for 2 decades in a pair of low-rent facilities in an old neighborhood that had nearly been written off. Most Clevelanders, and I would guess that most of you, want our city to develop a dynamic, resilient local economy, safe and appealing neighborhoods, and an environment where government is predictable, just, and provides meaningful opportunities for citizens to be involved in the decisions that affect their lives. It was definitely important to my business, where I could afford to purchase a group of boarded up and condemned wooden and brick buildings, remove the obsolete fire and water damage sections, and renovate the space for my office. My development at the corner then inspired and spurred on additional investment on the block, expanding an existing restaurant service business into Cleveland from Medina, creating a new craft beer exporting business, and establishing 2 popular drinking and eating spots in an area that had been scary and dangerous before. Architecturally and economically speaking, this broader definition of sustainability means we will need to conserve as much of the existing built environment as possible, and to carefully plan densification and compatible infill projects that will improve the sustainability of those civic attributes. If we want a sustainable, vibrant, diverse, and resilient economy, we simply don't have the time and cannot afford the luxury of demolishing still usable buildings. If we're to be successful, the policies and practices of government, real estate owners, and design and construction professionals will need to develop better, easier, and more cost-effective ways to improve the energy performance of historic and older buildings, and when necessary, to encourage the construction of new buildings that have low carbon footprints and are efficient to operate. Sustainability necessarily involves the collective future of Cleveland citizens in an ecological manner, where economic health and diversity is central to the issues of infrastructure management, land use, commercial real estate and housing, historic preservation, public health and education, government performance, and quality of life. Now, here's the hard part. We need to guard against the ideas of politicians, planners, designers, and developers who would squander our ability to continue into the future. Some of you may have attended the exhibit, probably not many of you, but some of you may have attended the exhibit in 1968 at the Cleveland Museum of Art, where this rendering of a fantasy of the future of Cleveland's East Side was displayed. The idea was that almost everything from downtown to University Circle would be cleared to be replaced with a series of very tall skyscrapers loosely based on Frank Lloyd Wright's Mile High skyscraper, and groups of high-rise apartment blocks based on Le Corbusier's Radiant City, surrounded by green space and ponds. And by the way, everyone who had lived there would be moved out into new housing projects to be built in landfills on the lake. I'm sure this wasn't intended to be as dystopian as it sounds today, and we can be thankful that this fantasy hasn't quite come to pass. But when we look at what would have existed at the time, the wide variety of building types and housing options appear that they house people and workers who can walk from place to place, who can use convenient mass transit to get to further destinations, and who very likely had personal relationships with their neighbors and a wider community of neighborhood residents who looked out for each other, asked questions, provided advice, guidance, and inspiration, and were able to coexist relatively peacefully and apparently with some level of prosperity. This approaches being a sustainable way for human beings to live and work together. The aspects of community provided by such architectural fabric do not exist in the utopian visions of the mid-century, and in fact, the economic diversity and resilience of a place like this would not exist in the utopian vision of 1968. The reason I bring this up is not only that we lose historic buildings when we allow them to be demolished, but we lose the communities and networks of people and their local economies that provide for real sustainability and resistance. When we plan, fund, and build new developments, we need to do a much better job than our predecessors if we're going to do it sustainably. Efforts at making Cleveland more sustainable will involve retaining and furthering not only our historic buildings, but our living, functioning culture, which contains so much of value and which was so hard won by our forebears. I'd like to show you some projects undertaken by Clevelanders and then photographs of the sections of Cleveland that were torn down to make way for them in the hope and expectation that the new would be better than the old. And I'd like you to think about how demolition and historic preservation relates to the idea of sustainability that includes local economy, community, and resilience under stress. Here's a rendering of the group plan of 1903. People are mostly probably familiar with this. And here we have a picture of the Leonard Case House on the corner of Public Square that was torn down to make way for the mall, and then commercial buildings in the background there. Here, rather than looking at the central feature of this picture, the public auditorium, we can see the kinds of buildings and houses and other things that are surrounding the building and what would have been cleared to make way for lawn. This one was really going to put Cleveland on the map, Erie View. Here we have the kind of low-rise commercial development that existed there beforehand and was all cleared away to make way for that plaza and the other buildings. These are the kind of buildings that were existing on that site before. You can see all the various signs from the storefronts and across the parapet walls of the building of various businesses and enterprises that existed there. There's a little bit better picture of that same corner. This building was right on the corner of 9th and Walnut. Here's a picture of looking down towards the intersection of 9th and Superior. Again, the building at 9th and Walnut. Building the Ritz, the Roxy Theater on 9th Street. The really astounding thing about these old pictures of 9th Street to me is that there's actually crowds of people on the sidewalk. Now, here's the big sacred cow and destroyer of the old heart of Cleveland's business district, the Terminal Tower Complex. Thousands of, so they say 1,000 buildings and businesses were relocated or moved out of the way for this building. And I'm just going to show you about 10 pictures of the buildings that were on this site before they cleared their way. And if you just imagine the kind of diversity of occupants and tenants and building owners and enterprises that could exist in these older buildings versus what we might find in a big office development like the Terminal Tower. Once they had finished purchasing and maybe people got to retire off the income they had from the sale of their building and the closure of their business. But once they had it, once it was all torn down, what we have is essentially an empty lot and a parking lot. This is almost the worst thing that we could do, is clear land and create empty land and parking lots. What's worse is the damage didn't stop here, with the erection of the Terminal Tower, but the highways came in the 1950s. Here is that section of Cleveland south of like Carnegie and the Terminal Tower in 1951. This is before the highways came through. And then this is a photograph of it after the highway came through, and you can imagine how many buildings and houses and enterprises would have been dislocated by that. And it's not that they can't relocate, and some of them in fact did move to the suburbs, but the lower cost real estate that allowed, that would have existed there is gone. And, it's troubling now that this district, within the last 20 years, has continued to suffer this kind of thing, and that the current people who occupy this site aren't diverse economic interests, but they're asking us to pay for the redecoration of their facilities. One wonders how much more sustainability we could buy for the right type of investment, and how much further along we could be toward the 2030 district goals. But then, I'm sorry, we're a little off track, and I'm sorry, we're here to talk about the importance of historic preservation, retrofitting historic buildings, and to be more energy efficient in making our world more sustainable. Thank you for watching the slides and listening to me go on.
Thank you for being here today, and given the fact that tomorrow is St. Patrick's Day, I have to hook it in with a reference to the classic "Oh Danny Boy." Oh Danny Boy, the walls and parapets are falling. I would sing it, but I've got my morning voice on. But unfortunately, many buildings with the brick veneers and facades end up being like this one. This is an undisclosed building downtown, picture taken. 02, about, I'm sorry, that was about 8 years ago, or, yeah, 2009. And a brick facade and a veneer can be thought of very much like you're playing the board game Scrabble, and all those tiles, all those pieces have to stay connected to the board if you stand the board up vertically. So what you need to do is support those individual pieces with a shelf angle or means of support, a set of hands, and then also they have to be connected back to the building, also known as the backup wall. As a structural engineer, the challenge is to keep those materials on the building. Everything that went into the building came from the ground. The ore for the steel, the sand and the clay for the bricks, and mortar, all that came from the ground, and this thing called gravity makes it all want to go back. So our job is to keep it up where it belongs, up on the building, keep it safe. Nobody wants to see a downtown area be a falling rock zone or any place. So that's our role, the architects and the engineers and the contractors. We all have to collaborate and make sure the buildings are maintained well, inspected. It's not an easy thing to get out on a building. You often need a boom lift or a rig to get out and look at these up close. You can do a limited amount of survey from the ground with binoculars and telescopes. And now we have this great thing called drones, which we're getting into inspecting with drones and at least getting a visual. But there's nothing better than being right up on the building with a hammer or a mallet and doing some light tapping and sounding to predict where some material will fall. This ordinance that was put in place was the result of this incident, which happened April 13th, 2015, almost 2 years ago. This is on East 6th Street. It's called the Garfield Building, and it happened about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a very cold winter, the winters of 2013 and 2014 into the spring of 2015. Very brutal cold. As materials get cold, they tend to shrink and contract on a building. As they heat up, they elongate. This building wall is the west wall of the building, about 200 feet long, and for years and years and years, with no joints in the wall. In the old days, they would build the walls solid and thick with material, a foot, sometimes 2 feet thick, of brick and tile. Years and years of elongating and contracting with the changes in temperature. And on top of that, you see there's a sloping roof behind it. That was a penthouse roof. It died right at the back of the parapet. So for 120 years, you had snow and ice filling the trough behind the parapet and giving it a little push every time the water would freeze and expand. So that portion of the wall was very vulnerable right along. So what happened on April 13th, it was the first 80-degree day. The sun was baking on that wall about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's what happened. About 50 feet of the parapet fell, about 4 foot tall and 50 foot long. And that's what happened down on the street. Now, these people were very fortunate. There were 5 occupants of this vehicle. They had just left the vehicle after they parked it 10 minutes before this happened. They went to dinner, went to a Cavaliers basketball game, came back 6 hours later, and their car was being loaded onto a flatbed and hauled away. So they were very fortunate. All the material, you can see a piece of terracotta over here sitting down. But at least 2,000 pounds of material fell down to the street. So this was the catalyst that had put the city ordinance through. It was a close call, and there have been many close calls over the years. I've been working for 31 years as a structural engineer with Barber & Hoffman, doing mostly repair and restoration, and about every year or two I'd hear either from a contractor or through sometimes the building owners would contact us, and sometimes the material falls in the middle of the day and nobody's around. Sometimes it falls on a weekend or at night, but this was a close call, so the city finally opened its eyes and enacted this ordinance. It went into effect June 6th of last year, and the effect of it is that by June 6th of this year, every building in the city that's more than 5 stories tall, or 50 years old, or 75 feet tall, whichever is shorter, 5 stories or 75 feet, must be inspected by a qualified architect, engineer, technician that could do a report, file a report, and they reference in, this is called City Ordinance 3143, and it's called exterior walls and appurtenances. Appurtenance is just a fancy word for saying everything else that goes along with the walls. The intent is to do a complete survey from the ground and close-up areas where you can, adjacent roofs and windows, to do a visual of the building. And if the expert finds anything suspicious at all, the intent is to make sure you report that to the city and to the building owner and take aggressive steps to remediate the apparent damage. If there's something ready to fall, or something that looks like it's in serious condition that might endanger the public, And that's the whole motivation for this, is public safety. Anybody walking or driving on the street could be vulnerable to this falling material. So if there is a drastic condition on the wall, you're supposed to report that immediately, and then the professional is supposed to come up with a means, both short-term and long-term, to stabilize that material. Either if it's loose and hanging, if you have a, say, a cornice or a parapet that's hanging off the wall and ready to fall, the center of gravity is off and ready to pop off the building. You either have to strap or pin that back to the building or remove it temporarily, which leaves a wound on the building, unfortunately, and then come up with a means to fix it later. But the immediate concern is to make it safe, so that in this case, on East 6th, this was I was actually on this building for the next 2 weeks. The city was very interested in what we were doing because they wanted to make sure things were repaired and buttoned up very fast, because they had to close East 6th and Euclid Avenue. It just so happened the Cavaliers were in the playoffs, so they couldn't have closed streets, during that. So we had to hustle and get our details. We were working almost around the clock to come up with repair details. The parapet and the wall up top were so bad you could literally pull bricks out with your bare hand. The mortar had turned to sand and deteriorated that badly. So we had to come up with strapping and pinning, and the building is now currently under renovation. It's being repurposed, and so much of that parapet was rebuilt. So I guess to wrap up, the city ordinance actually involves, they invoke ASTM, the American Society of Testing Materials, ASTM standard E2270, which lays out a 6 or 7 step process. The first step, you have to review available architectural and engineering drawings, and unfortunately a lot of these old buildings, they're not available. You can go to the city archive. There's a gentleman there, Martin Hauserman, at the city archives. He's very helpful. If they exist, they can usually find them within 5 or 10 minutes for you, and then you can arrange for copies to be made. They're very, very valuable. It's a valuable resource if you're lucky enough to have existing drawings. The second step is the professional needs to prepare inspection drawings to document all your observations that you will find on the walls. And some of these buildings, 15, 20 stories tall. Now, it's a large undertaking, so you have to make sure you get the notes recorded at the right spot. If there's a suspect window head or a lintel that's failing, or a cornice that looks like it's shifted and moved or cracked, all that has to be documented. The service history is step 3. You have to do some research into the service history. Have they maintained the building? Have they neglected it for 20 years? Is there any documentation on record? The professional is supposed to review that history with the building owner and the building maintenance department. The fourth step is a leak survey, and make sure the building doesn't have any obvious signs, especially along the top floor. If there's been water infiltration along the perimeter of the building, that is a red flag that there could be water inside, freeze-thaw deterioration, corroded lintels, and on and on. Water getting inside the building wall is not a good thing, and it causes tremendous damage. After that, the facade inspection, all the notes are recorded, visual, usually with a telescope or binoculars, digital photography. If you're lucky enough to be able to get into adjacent buildings around the site or neighboring roofs, that's a plus to inspect it from the ground. And then, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's up to the design professional to flag both to the building owner and to report to the city if there's anything dangerous to the public. That's the design professional or the inspecting professional's obligation, first and foremost, to protect life and health of the public. That's why we're registered as engineers, to protect public safety. And then lastly, prepare the report and submit that to the building owner. The professional does not have to submit the report to the city. There is a one-page form. I think you made that available on handouts? Or it's available on the website. It's a one-page form the professional fills out. The city doesn't want to collect thousands of these 10 or 20 or 30-page reports. They want the one-page summary signed by the design professional. It's up to the building owner or manager to submit that form to the city, and it attests that a report has been prepared, it's in place, and occasionally the city may audit it, just like when you, as a professional architect or engineer, occasionally may be audited on your CPU or PDH units. I hope that doesn't happen, but it does happen. And the city wants to maintain these on record to make sure that all the due diligence has been done, and the penalty, it says, the penalty for non-compliance is, last bit says, whoever violates this provision of this chapter is guilty of a misdemeanor of the first degree. Each day which non-compliance or violation continues shall constitute a separate offense. So if they let this go beyond June 6th, every day that goes by, the city will interpret that as another violation. So what the penalties are exactly, I can't tell you. I guess that remains to be seen. But the real penalty is if something like this happens and puts numerous people in trouble. And with that, I guess I can conclude. And if there's any brief questions, be glad to entertain. Yes?
You mentioned that qualified architects and or engineers and architects are
Yes.
qualified for the inspections. And then you said other qualified technicians.
Yeah, that's...
What does that mean?
How they define it in the city ordinance, they say qualified inspector, in quotes, means either the following: a design professional certified in inspection of the specific elements that make up the facade of the structure and licensed by the state of Ohio, so that would imply architect or engineer, or to a special inspector or inspection agency accredited and experienced in the specific type of structure being inspected and qualified under the Ohio Building Code for special inspectors. So that's a little bit of a gray area. It's maybe subject to interpretation, but the bottom line is the chief building officer for the city of Cleveland, Tom Vanover is his name. He said he knows who the qualified people are, and if they see somebody who's trying to put out credentials that aren't quite, if that individual is not known for doing this kind of work, that's the type of report that might be audited. And what they don't want is somebody to say, hey, give me $500, I'll drive by, take a look at your building, a few pictures, okay, you're good for another 5 years. Because that is really what you're up against as a professional. The inspection interval is every 5 years, and you're supposed to assure either the building is safe for 5 years or put a plan of action into place to repair and remedy anything that's suspect. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, somewhat. I've got coworkers
Sure.
that have been masons for 30 years.
Sure.
You know, they can spot a building 3 blocks away
Mhm.
and tell me what's wrong with it before I even know the building was there. So that just kind of
Yeah,
made me wonder, is there...
the key phrase, it says qualified under the Ohio Building Code for special inspectors. So I think you'd have to go into that language. If there's any doubt, you can go to the city, talk to Tom Vanover, and he might give a little more insight as to who can be qualified or not. But they really don't want just anyone to just do a drive-by report and file a letter and say, you're good for 5 years, give me my fee. And it's just putting public health and safety at jeopardy. And so the key is to protect the public first and foremost. Now, as far as architects involved, architects and engineer, we like to preserve the building so it's aesthetically pleasing and it doesn't leave a wound or a sore or straps or pins or all kinds of things that really don't belong there. You'd like to restore the building to its original splendor, but often building owners are unprepared and they can't believe the cost. Sometimes they say that they don't have the money to do it right, so sometimes unfortunately, some of these features are taken off, like cornices and overhangs that are on the building, but it's part of the historic fabric of the building. But the key thing is they're often held back to the building with steel rods or anchors, and steel tends to disintegrate over time. If there's pins or rods, sometimes they have steel rods about the diameter of this pen, 1/4 inch, and they hook them and tie and pin the face material to the backup. Many times we've seen either these rods are totally disintegrated or down to the diameter of a paper clip, and it's a jigsaw puzzle up in the air, 10, 15, 20 stories up. And when you have a 20 or 30 pound or more block of terracotta or masonry or stone held back with something the size of a paper clip or less, that's not a comforting thought. So when we do an inspection, we'll do our sounding and try to peel off any loose material and then alert the owner if there's anything wrong. But that's a close-up inspection. A close-up inspection is only required in this ordinance if you see something that's suspect. Any other questions? Yes.
Ron,
Yes, go
can you talk for a little bit about what has happened since the
Since June 2017 is coming up pretty soon, what's happened in the intervening year to building inspections in the downtown?
Well, we've gotten very busy. We're doing probably 2 or 3 of these reports a week, and as the date approaches, we're probably going to get more calls. But people who are aware of the ordinance, they're hopping onto it. But it's any building in the city. It could be a church spire, it could be a chimney on a building. Anything that's more than 75 feet tall or 5 stories, by definition, has to be inspected. So it's definitely seen an uptick in activity. Another question in the back?
You answered the question. I was going to ask
Okay.
about chimneys.
Yes.
Whether that ordinance is-
Yes, anything that could pose a public danger. In the city's focus, naturally, will be anything more in a highly populated area. That will get greater attention. But the way the ordinance reads, it should be any structure in the city over 5 stories and 75 feet tall. Anything else? Well, thank you for your attention, and enjoy the holiday tomorrow.
You all hear me? Is this working? I'm planning to talk today about historic tax credit programs that are available specifically in the state of Ohio, although one is a federal program. And these tax credits are used in pretty much all of the major historic rehabilitation projects that you see happening around downtown Cleveland, as well as in a lot of the surrounding neighborhoods. And across the country, many historic rehab projects rely on historic tax credits as one of the critical funding sources. So the first thing that you have to consider if you're interested in historic tax credits is whether or not the building qualifies. And in order to qualify, it has to be a designated historic building. So that means it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Typically, those are buildings that are more than 50 years old, and they have historic integrity, meaning they haven't been altered so substantially that you can't recognize them anymore. And they have to have some level of historical significance as well. It's about a year process from start to finish to get a building listed on the National Register, but a fairly straightforward process. And that's just kind of the base requirement that you have to have in order to qualify. Just as some examples, I know we're going to be talking about the 9 later, and this is a good example because obviously the Rotunda building you would expect to be historic, and it has been listed on the National Register for some time, but Breuer Tower was not, and was originally contemplated for demolition, and at that point historic tax credits actually could not have been used on the tower because it had not been designated. So there had to be an extra step to expand that National Register nomination to include the Breuer Tower before the tax credit could be applied to that portion of the building. Schofield building is part of a historic district, but as many of you know, the facade was completely covered. So before it could be formally designated as a contributing building within the historic district and therefore eligible for tax credits, the entire false facade had to be removed. So that was just the initial step just to get the building qualified. Other kinds of properties qualify certainly too. Industrial complexes are commonly listed on the National Register. So a property might be an individual building, or it could be a complex of buildings, or an entire historic district. So just in downtown Cleveland, these are sort of footprints of the historic districts that are already on the National Register. So this is in addition to buildings that are individually listed, all of these areas are historic districts. And so within those districts, buildings are designated as contributing or non-contributing. And if they're a contributing building within the district, meaning they're old enough and they still have their integrity, then they qualify for the historic tax credits. So again, you can see a pretty large area of downtown Cleveland is within historic districts, so these tools are available to a large number of properties. The the two basic tax credit programs. There's a federal historic tax credit and a state historic tax credit. So at the federal level, it's a 20% tax credit. And that 20% is related to what they call the qualified rehabilitation expenditure. So all the money that is spent on rehabilitating the historic building, you're basically going to get a 20% credit against that cost that comes in the form of a tax credit. So that's all the hard costs. It's also many of the soft costs associated with the development. The big categories that are not included in that qualified expenditure basis are acquisition is not included, any enlargement of the building, so if you're making additions, those expenses would not be included, and things like site work or anything sort of outside the envelope of the building. And then finally, anything that's personal property, so appliances, things that can be taken out of the building would not qualify for this credit. But all those other expenses get put in the bucket, and 20% of that comes back as a federal historic tax credit. There's no limit on the amount of tax credits. This is a long-standing federal program, and as long as you follow the process and follow the rules, and you have a qualified building and project, you get this 20% federal tax credit. There's a three-part application process. Part one is just, do you have a historic building or not? Is it on the National Register? And if it's in a district, does it contribute to the district? Part two is about what you're going to do to the building. So that's making sure that the building is going to meet historic standards. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then part three is when you're done with the project, documenting that you did what you said you were going to do in part two of the application, and showing the completed work. The review process goes through two agencies. It's a federal program, and the National Park Service is the agency, the federal agency in charge of the program, but they really delegate a lot of the heavy lifting to the State Historic Preservation Office. Every state has one. Ohio has a very robust and active State Historic Preservation Office. There's a lot of historic tax credit work happening in Ohio. Very helpful staff there and good resources, but they're also the ones who review these projects and make the determinations on each of these application forms. In addition to the federal historic tax credit, back in the end of 2006, Ohio enacted a state-level historic tax credit, basically that piggybacks off of the federal credit and adds on to it. I can't remember the current count right now, but some 30 states, maybe more, have state historic tax credits today. It's a very common tool that a lot of states have used, but Ohio has one of the better programs in the nation. Again, it's a 25% credit that's against that same qualified rehab expenditure number. But the big difference with the state credit is it's a limited pool of funds and a competitive application process. So it's not an automatic thing like the federal, if you follow the rules, you get the credit. The state credit has a $60 million annual allocation of tax credits. And so there are two application rounds in March and September where they give out $30 million in tax credits in each round. There's a maximum of $5 million per building or project. That's the max you can receive in historic tax credit, so that would be supporting $20 million of qualified expenditure. You have to be the fee simple owner or a long-term lessee. You have to have the National Register designation that you need for the federal credit, although for the state credit, you can also qualify by means of a local designation through the city of Cleveland. Same kind of review process for the project itself, but there's an additional level because of this competitive nature. There's a 100-point application. There's a competitive application with a 100-point scoring matrix. So they basically look at your project, and there's a whole series of categories. It has to do with the location, sort of the economic impact, what kind of benefits this is going to generate, and how ready you are. They want to see that you've got all your other financing sources in place, that you really have a viable project but for this credit. They break the pools down into different sizes because initially they didn't have this, but obviously there are advantages to being a larger project in the scoring, and so there was a lot of the dollars were going to bigger projects, so they created 3 separate pools now. They have a small pool under 1.25 million in qualified expenditure and a maximum of 250,000 in credits. That pool, actually the past 2 rounds, every project that applies in that pool has been funded. They actually have more dollars allocated to that pool than they have projects, so those smaller projects, this is actually a really good program for them. Harder for them to use the federal tax credit, but the state tax credit is much easier. Intermediate pool is 1 to 10 million. That's where you see the bulk of the projects that are applying. And then anything above $10 million project goes into the large pool, which is by far the most competitive. So you kind of see there, these are kind of the ranges of points that you have to score on an application to be funded. And you can see as the pool goes up, you need a higher score to be successful. But a great program, it's really been very successful. You're seeing it used all across the state, and not just in Cleveland and Cincinnati and Columbus, but in small towns all across the state. I think there are some 40 different communities that have received state historic tax credits at this point. There's, they've awarded maybe 200 some credits, but a lot of activity going on through this program. So this is, and actually this map is a little bit outdated, but this is relatively recent, and these dots are all federal historic tax credit projects that have happened just in downtown Cleveland. These are state tax credit projects that have happened in downtown Cleveland. And again, that would have just been, these state credits would have just been since 2007, with the bulk of the activity really in the past 5-7 years. And so what you can see is, I mean, these programs are having a huge impact in downtown Cleveland. All the rehabilitation that you see, all these historic building conversions that you see happening would not have happened if not for these 2 historic tax credits. It's really a critical funding source, and not just for Cleveland, but for comparable cities all across the country, and smaller towns, again, are really getting on board. I say that because I have to get a quick plug in, because the federal historic tax credit is currently being threatened. A lot of the comprehensive tax reform proposals that are on the table eliminate all credits and deductions as a way to lower rates across the board. And this is a program that places like Cleveland really can't afford to see go away. It would be really devastating. And so keep that in mind. Make sure you're talking to your congresspeople, letting them know what an important tool this is, so it really makes a big difference in our city. If you're doing a historic tax credit project, you have to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. That's just a set of 10 broad guidelines. It sort of outlines what it means to do historic preservation. And there are a whole large collection of guidelines that go along with these standards that give you much more specific information about how the standards are interpreted, how to do these things technically. A lot of good information on the National Park Service website. But basically what this is saying is repair something before you replace it. If you have to replace it in kind if you can, or with something that matches. Where you need to make changes, do it sensitively so that you don't destroy the historic character of the building. But there's a lot of flexibility in terms of the use of these credits and the application of the standards. Sometimes I know it scares people off, but really there's a ton of flexibility. This is the Southworth building over on Ontario, a recent project, and a common problem in these downtown buildings where you have vast areas of dark, deep spaces toward the rear of the building that you can't really activate for residential use, which is the dominant market in downtown Cleveland now. So this is the same building. We cut an atrium down through the back part of the building so that you can get light on 2 ends. and get viable housing space in the back, and it also makes for a really compelling space and something that's inviting and attractive to residents. Many of you may have seen the Bridgeview atrium, similar thing that was created through the building, a big warehouse, very deep, difficult to convert for another use. Cutting this atrium down through brings the light in that allowed all those apartments to go into the building, and that was all allowed through the historic tax credit program. You can see we also did some rooftop construction, so those kinds of things certainly can happen. Everybody remember when West 25th looked like this? It was really not too long ago, but hard to believe. So that's freezing Shuley, and again, additions are, while not qualified for the historic tax credits, certainly can happen as part of a historic rehab project, and that's common particularly for a smaller building. So that's one that was filled in with a new addition, apartments in the historic building and condominiums in the new. And you can see the wall of the historic building then becomes part of the interior courtyard. This is our office. It's another infill project in the warehouse district. And there's my contact information. So yeah, just again to recap, it's a really important tool, absolutely necessary in most of these historic rehabs, and a great resource for building owners that want to rehab their buildings.
Thank you. Questions?
What about government buildings, you know, what aid or funding can they get for, you know,
So,
renovating some of these historic buildings?
So
Since
the
they're not-
building, right, the building has to be income producing, so it can have tax exempt tenants, which happens all the time. But government entities have a hard time using historic tax credits. They rely on other sources of funding. Yeah, it does have to be a privately held income producing property. So you can't use this on your own house or anything. You also can't create condominiums, at least for the first 5 years of the project, because you're not allowed to sell the property for 5 years after you complete the rehab.
Does that mean 501c3s that own the structure don't have any benefit from this?
501c3s are a tricky animal. They can absolutely use it. There are a lot of nonprofit organizations that have used this. The Cleveland Institute of Art, for example, they're building on Euclid, the old Ford Motor Company plant. That's a historic tax credit project. It creates some complications, particularly if the nonprofit has occupied the building prior to undertaking the rehab project. But a lot of times there are ways to work through that. So nonprofits typically can take advantage of these and often do.
So federal tax credits might be in jeopardy. What's the future of the state, Ohio state tax credit?
Well, as it stands right now, the state of Ohio tax credit is a permanent program. There's, again, this $60 million annual allocation is not something that has to be re-upped. It's just an automatic. With that said, there is certainly always potential, and as we move into budget season, we're always aware and cautious and making sure that we're paying attention. We haven't heard of any significant threats to the state tax credit program, although again, who knows what's going to happen in the budget cycle. We know there's going to be a shortfall. They're going to be talking about cuts, and there was an effort 2 years ago, I guess it was the last budget cycle, there was a bill introduced that would have eliminated this tax credit, and there was overwhelming pushback from across the state, and they quickly pulled back from that. They did start a commission, so they've been investigating different ways that they might modify the program, but as of now, it seems like it's fairly safe. The big problem with the state tax credit program right now is that there's not nearly enough funds to support all the projects that are applying. So every round we're getting about $100 million of tax credit requests when there's only $30 million available. So only about a third or less than a third, 30% or so of the projects are being funded.
Seems like a lot of examples you showed focus more on rehab, but what about just not very significant but retrofits such as building envelope and HVAC and windows? I mean, just depending on the size of the budget too.
So there is a requirement that it has to be a substantial rehabilitation. So what that means is that the cost of the rehab, so that QRE number, has to exceed the adjusted basis of the building. So the value of the building, not including the land. So, if you go buy a building for $1 million and the land is worth $500,000, you would have to spend $500,001 to qualify for that tax credit. So that's the big thing, and then obviously it has to be a qualified historic building. That's the only requirement, though, in terms of the amount of rehab that's done. They don't compel you to do anything. It's just whatever you do has to follow the standards. And so there is a 10% federal tax credit for non-historic buildings that are not listed on the register, built before 1936. So that's another option. It has much less stringent requirements, but obviously less benefit too.
Thank you very much.
There's one more, sorry.
A quick question, Peter. We design and construct photovoltaic solar projects. If a solar project is incorporated into a renovation project that's subject to the historic tax credit, is the solar portion also part of that cost, total cost system?
Yes, yes, it would. Yeah, all the mechanical systems, anything that's supporting that building would qualify.
To my previous question, what funding or credits or whatever are available to a government entity trying to renovate a historic building? Anything you know?
I mean, nothing specifically targeting that. I mean, there are grant programs out there. Most of them, are
Grants.
yeah. I mean, I think grants is pretty much your only option other than typical government funding streams.
Okay, last question, because we're going to run a little bit behind time.
Historic monuments that are owned, controlled by a nonprofit, and they're not income producing. How do you get around, or you don't get around?
Yeah, it has to have an income producing use. So, and a lot of monuments might actually be classified as structures as opposed to buildings. So the tax credit only applies to something that they consider a building, which is something that's constructed intent for human habitation. So it does have to be a building. Some monuments include building portions, and they could. I mean, if you're charging people to come into the building and visit, then that's income producing. So it doesn't have to be profit generating. It just has to produce some level of income. So
I thought it also has to create jobs, or is that just Ohio?
the state tax credit, the state historic tax credit, because of the competitive nature, the job creation is one of the factors that goes into that. So you need some of that in order to be competitive. It's not an absolute requirement, but just because of the competitive nature, generally you need that to be successful. Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say thank you to Ken Goldberg, who had originally pointed out this opportunity for me to participate, and of course to Cindy for putting this all together. I was pretty excited about this opportunity because over the 9 years since I first looked at this building, this will be the first time that I've presented it where I'm not asking for some kind of approval. So it takes a little bit of pressure off. And I did want to include a slide here, just briefly. This is just a partial list of all the approvals that we went through on this project. Dozens and dozens. these were from the various programs the building was in, public agencies, the various phases of construction, and then of course the Ohio and federal preservation tax credit application process, as Peter had mentioned. I did want to mention the project team. We had a real expert team put together that worked very successfully together, including ourselves from Studio CRM, Sandvik Architects, Peter and Karen Borland from their office were very involved with the project. Bioloski Cleveland, Warren Red out of New York, Barber and Hoffman, Blue Street Consulting, which originally starting the project was Austrian Associates, Art and Science Lighting. We had Sextant Group out of Pittsburgh helping us on acoustics, and of course Cleveland Construction, who was our construction manager. I came across this photo going through a bunch of the photos during construction. I just had to do this because I can very distinctly see the outline of Peter and his distinct glasses there, so I happen to see you were part of the project, if you were to deny it. You can also see here, this was the central historic stair in the building, one of the landings. There really wasn't much left historically inside of the building, and the stair was pretty awful looking. It had been painted many times. It was this kind of strange pink mauve color, but we were able to really improve the appearance of it. Just briefly, I wanted to run through some of the key points on the building history and go through a few historic images. We were lucky with this project, I think just really because of its prominent location downtown, to have quite a few lively renderings and photos of what it originally looked like. The building was constructed in 1901 by Levi Schofield. As many of you know, he was also its architect. He designed other structures such as the Cleveland Soldiers and Sailors Monument, of which there's a view from inside the Schofield building. I'll come back to that later. The Cleveland YMCA and the infamous Mansfield Penitentiary of Shawshank Redemption fame. The building was originally the site of a 3-story like residential type of hotel that was built by Levi's father, William. The new building was constructed at 14 stories, also had that cupola on top of it that was a few stories tall. It says that originally it had 429 offices in it. I think they all were fairly small, but quite a beehive of activity. And that it included such modern features at the time as hydraulic elevators and enclosed spiral fire escapes. I'm going to come back to that as well in a later slide. These were enclosed in very heavy masonry walls that posed a challenge for us. The exterior was a red-orange brick and terracotta. The building was a steel framed, and between the column bays was a flat arch that was created, what is commonly referred to as speed block. I also want to point out here, some of you may or may not know this, but the City Club, before the facade of it was extended and renovated, there was actually this step back here between the two buildings. When you go in the building now, because of how they reconfigured the City Club, I think it's up to floor 4, is covered on the corner there, so there's no longer windows. Let's take a look at a few of the additional historic images that we have. I like this kind of time-elapse one here at street level. Again, you get the original City Club facade in that shot. So the building, kind of largely looked the same. We're getting into the 50s and 60s. And apparently, window air conditioning units were becoming all the rage. So the building didn't look quite as appealing as it had earlier on. And getting into the 60s is when a modernization program was considered for the building. What happened with that modernization program was on the outside, a fiberglass curtain wall was added in this lovely beige and brown color palette. The main entry of the building was actually moved off center, which we'll take a closer look at that a little later on. But the building did remain office use even after this modernization. Kind of a funny story here too to mention. As it turned out, Bialowski being part of the team, when we went to find drawings of this curtain wall that had been put on, their office actually did this. So they got to be a part of, bringing it back to life again. And Jack Bialowski, who had founded the firm, told us that his partner at the time was the one who did it. He didn't know anything about it. Just briefly, my first visit to the property was in the fall of 2007, so quite a while ago. I actually toured through the property with one of the people who is on the development team. He took me through, showing me its current condition, and was kind of asking me what I thought about, trying to do something different with it, which I told him I thought it was crazy. I didn't know how it was going to happen. But somehow he convinced me to be involved. And I have this photo in here. I just want to show you where this really all started, the process of putting this building back together. Basically, as Peter had mentioned earlier, the first step that had to be taken was to kind of roll the dice and pull that curtain wall off the building to be able to reestablish it as contributing to the Euclid Avenue Historic District. In order to do that, we had to get mass climbers on the building that could, in a tight site, be able to access the panels to be able to start to pull them off. Even just getting to the point where we could have the mass climbers was complicated, and I spent quite a bit of time in the basement and in these sidewalk vaults. We had to do some analysis to figure out how to actually be able to put some substructure through the sidewalk vaults in order to support the weight of the mass climbers. Again, just to get to a point where we could start to peel off the curtain wall and see what lied beneath. I guess they figured if this didn't scare me off, that nothing would. This is just showing you a bit of progress on taking the curtain wall off. We were all curious to see what we would find beneath. And essentially what we were left with was the face brick was in relatively good condition. Not much of it was damaged. But the curtain wall where it had been placed off the building was just tight enough into the original masonry that they just kind of blasted out every detail that had any real relief to it. So a lot of the decorative terracotta elements have been either completely removed or severely damaged. And then this is, a shot of essentially what we were left with when all the curtain wall had been removed. In spite of this appearance, though, again, as Peter had mentioned earlier, it was established that the building would be considered contributing to the Euclid Avenue Historic District, and we would be able to move forward with the tax credit process. One kind of funny thing to note in this photo, if you notice there's still some windows in place right through here. We had a period of overlap. It was just like a week or two where the last tenant in the building where we were helping to relocate had to stay in business. It was a dentist's office. Now, we were all wise enough to know that this is not the most weatherproof condition that we were left with, but hope that things would work out. But of course, a night or two into this horrific torrential downpour storm moved through, and space took on a little bit of water, but we all worked together to help clean it up. I just want to point out a few things here on timing, and then we'll get into a little more detail on the exterior restoration. Once the building was considered to be contributing again. It was 2008, 2009 timeframe. Also, financial crisis was in full swing. During that time, we were doing a lot of work on determining the right mix for the project in terms of hotel versus apartment in order to be able to get financing. So there were many iterations of the plans that were done and studying the various mixes in the building to get it just right in order to work for financing and the pro forma. 2010, the credits were awarded, and then from 2010, 2012, a couple years there was substantial interior abatement going on, demo, and then materials were being brought down to the building and sorted and being recycled. So we were diverting as many materials as possible from landfill. And then it was really 2013 when we were kind of all in with the AE team and the construction team to go full speed ahead and really start to put it all back together. Before we got into, VIP was the restoration contractor on this, and before they really got into actually putting pieces and parts back together, the whole facade was clean. And we happened to notice there's a couple blogs out there talking about Cleveland historic buildings. And we were really getting some harsh comments on there about how could these people paint this building orange? Like, people were shocked by the actual color of the brick because it's pretty intense. I think everyone's kind of gotten used to it now that it's been that way for a few years, but I guess it was quite shocking to some people in the beginning. A few things to point out on the restoration. The first couple stories, so up to this water table line here, things that are more at pedestrian level, more of the parts of the building that you can touch and feel and see in detail. Anything that was terracotta there was put back as terracotta. And then once you get up above that level of the building, the decorative parts that were recreated were done out of FRP that was colored to match as closely as possible the original terracotta. The entry of the building was returned to its center position where it had been moved off center in the modernization program. We did not end up putting a cupola back on the building, but we did add the new canopy that you just saw there. Just going to run through a few of these slides. We really like the way this detail worked out. This is at the main entry. The entry vestibule steps back a bit and creates this kind of neat little sight line into the new lobby. A few things to note on here, the shields that are up at the 11th story of the building. While you can see them in the historic photos, it wasn't entirely clear what the actual imagery was on the shields. So Sandvik took some creative license and came up with some things that we thought would be appropriate to the building, including a image of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, which you can see on this shield here as it was arriving on site. The little lunch table configuration there, I thought that might be the nicest place to have lunch in downtown Cleveland at the time. That was before those column capitals went in. And then the lower left there is just a shot from up high direction on one of the mast climbers as the exterior restoration was winding down. This shows you, when you're coming up, when you're heading south on 9th Street, the shorter facade there, again up at the 11th floor, marks the year that the building was completed, 1901. So that was all put back in place. Just another view. This is from the 9th Street facade, and Schofield's name is spelled out in the shields on that side. Mention a few things here on the building planning floor plans. Going back to that original conversation with the development team, their idea was that this building has some awkward things about it. It's F-shaped, as you get up above the ground floor. And the floor plates are pretty tight, and they're pretty shallow as well, like along the United Street side. So essentially, it wasn't very viable for modern office use, and that's one of the reasons why the building was not doing as well as it had in previous decades. So it seemed that it would be a better fit for residential use and hotel use. So we really focused our planning efforts on that. The ground floor plan, there was a desire to retain some retail at the corner of Euclid and 9, being such an important intersection downtown. As I mentioned before, the entry to the building being moved back on center, we focused the hotel and apartment, the building lobby in the middle there. Also, that was where the elevators are located. And then as you move south, there is a restaurant space. Behind that, pre-function and banquet space that leads into the banquet room. And then the back corner of the building, the southwest corner, there is a separate residential lobby. Residents can use that for general purpose. Mailboxes are back there, and then they also have a freight elevator to use for move-in, so that that kind of traffic doesn't overlap with the hotel lobby. The other thing we were trying to do here is where that pre-function space is placed. Residents in the building can actually use that as a passage to get back and forth. If they want to hang out in the lobby or the restaurant, go back in and grab their mail before they go back up to their apartment. So it works out pretty nicely that way. We went through the approval process for getting a new curb cut here for a drop-off lane for the hotel. Figured out a way to take the existing Euclid corridor improvements and turn the corner with it. Give a little more definition to where the main entry is with pavers that are like the ones on the Euclid corridor. But really, the rest of the site, there's not much left, and it is basically a sea of utility vaults. So it was just essentially some new concrete flatwork and getting the sidewalk vaults to be weatherproof. Just a couple of typical floor plans here. Essentially, the 2nd through 7th floor are pretty much the same plan, and then the 8th through the 14th floor are pretty much the same plan. 2 through 7 are the hotel floors. There's a variety of hotel suite types. The larger, more special suites are focused to the north end, where you have the greater, more expansive views. Similarly with the apartments, again, there's a variety of suite types and sizes. The bigger, bit more luxurious suites are focused towards the north end, again with the big expansive views. There are 122 hotel rooms total and 52 apartments. The suites, hotel and apartment suites, were planned around the original corridor path through the building. Really the only exception, I guess, that would be in the apartment floors in order to get the units to lay out and be viable, kind of drop it back tighter to the exterior wall just back here. One other thing I think it's worth noting is the central stair, which was again kind of that last existing piece of history on the interior that we wanted to feature. It had been enclosed over the years as a fire stair, so surrounded with masonry wall. We wanted to find a way to leave it open to the corridor as you were passing through and not have to jog around it. I mean, one, we would be losing some precious space on a tight floor plate. And two, we really wanted people to be able to walk by and experience. So this condition that you're seeing here in the middle, we used a total door, a concealed door system that opens into the corridor wall. So those are on hold opens, and then in an alarm situation, they close down, and that does become a completely enclosed rated stairwell. The building went through the alternate compliance, OBC Chapter 34 process, and went through figuring out how to do the compartmentation in the building, which is kind of breaking it down into smaller fire areas. Run through what we would say would be some of the bigger project challenges. This first slide here is just simply a view of one of the typical conditions that we found with that speed block. The speed block is, essentially it's a flat arch that's running between the column lines, and the problem with it is that I think, really anything that's maybe bigger than a foot square opening in it, you just kind of get to a point where you might as well drop the whole bay and just infill to where you need, which is clearly a very expensive thing to do. So we had to be very clever about where we were planning vertical shafts, openings through the building to make sure that we were limiting how much of the existing structure that we were removing. This just kind of gives you an idea of some of the systems that we were dealing with, where we had, this is actually increasing the depth of where the new elevators went in place of the old, where you did have to drop out part of the bay, kind of marry together a new, more modern steel floor system with the old structure. We also found, especially on the ground floor, a lot of the steel that ended up being exposed had been corroded. It was from salt damage where various entries on the building had been relocated. I think we almost got to a point with the ground floor where in hindsight we might have been better to just demo the entire thing and start over with a new floor system, because we ended up doing so many infills to it. Also included this slide. This was something I mentioned earlier, that enclosed spiral fire stair. The upper left corner there between the edge of the window and then where you see the little jog in the masonry was about a 6-foot radius masonry structure that went all the way up and down through the building that contained one of those fire escapes. The decision was made pretty early on that we needed to remove that because it really gave us much greater flexibility to get another stack of hotel rooms in there, as well as a more viable apartment unit back in that corner. So that all came out. I felt pretty guilty about that decision, seeing the amount of labor that went into removing all that masonry. And then across that back section, the opening that you're seeing there is where the freight elevator went in through the building. Another detail I just wanted to mention, the building had its a sleeper system beneath the subfloor that was pretty much intact throughout the building. We tried to do something a bit clever here where we were cutting into the sleeper system in select areas in order to create a curbless shower detail that appears in some of the hotel rooms as well as in some of the apartments, which is a little bit of a luxury touch to it, and maybe a bit of a unique way to approach that sleeper system layer. And then that's kind of how the final condition of that looks. You can see the floor of one of the hotel suites. Another challenge that we dealt with, again this is getting back to vertical systems and conveyance, is the stacking of the apartment floors over the hotel. You can see at that 7th, 8th floor line there, the transitions that were made in the stack diagrams here. And I've got a slide just to show you. This is actually the 7th floor corridor in the hotel where all of this transition happens. I mean, there is not a square inch that's wasted up there. But we all work together to figure this out and make it work together. I mean, you've got everything from the sprinkler system, mechanical system, all the plumbing transitions between the two uses, and then even just getting the lighting in that corridor. Got a few before and afters to share with you here. This is a original shot of the building lobby prior to the renovation, where it was off-center. And then this is essentially from the same angle. The building entry moved that bay north where it originally was, opened up more space for the building lobby. which includes a fireplace, and then these millwork column enclosures have these little seating niches in them. These seem to be favorites for photo ops when people are visiting. I really like this shot. This is from the transition from the pre-function area into what's now the banquet room. And you'd be surprised how actually late in construction this photo was taken, because the ground floor was so complicated in putting back together. It was really getting, it was a little behind the other floors. And this just kind of shows you what that area looks like now. This was actually we reconfigured the fire stair as it went through to the ground floor, but this was an actual location of where the stair came down originally. This is Old View, a restaurant that was on the ground floor. And then this is what we had today at Parker's downtown. The restaurant was also a bit of a challenge. Their kitchen, along with the catering kitchen for the hotel, is all in the basement. Getting the necessary exhaust out of the kitchen space, kind of winding up and through the building and getting it to that second floor roof was a real routing challenge. It's a bit of a maze to figure out. This is the ground floor elevator lobby as it was prior to renovation and what it looks like today. Again, with the building entry being back on center. And what you're seeing in the foreground here is the transition up into that pre-function space. This was an upper floor elevator lobby prior to renovation. There were actually 4 elevator cars in the center. That last one that you see at the end that's perpendicular was the smallest elevator cab I've ever been in. You could barely fit 2 people in there. And I'm not claustrophobic, but it was a bit scary. So I'm kind of glad that went away. And then the 3 elevators in the center just became 2 larger cabs that are ADA compliant and a little more functional for hotel service. And that's what one of the typical elevator lobbies on the upper floors looks like now. This was some of the original office space. This was actually where a corridor would have typically run. It just happened to be part of an office suite. Another corridor before renovation. I mean, this is kind of what I was seeing the first time I went through the building. And then this is a typical corridor condition today on a hotel floor. The carpet that you're seeing here was patterned after a sock. Interesting detail. I really like this next series of shots. This was prior to the curtain wall being removed, and something that was really significant about putting back the original windows is that the original openings were much larger. So you can't even really, it doesn't do it justice in the photos, but the sight lines that it opened up and the natural light that it lets back in are pretty dramatic from what was originally there. So in this shot you can see over to the rotunda, which is now Heinen's. At the time it wasn't, which I can't imagine downtown without Heinen's at this point. But here you see a hotel suite, and looking back out to the rotunda as it is today. And again, you can see how much larger the window openings are. A similar view from one of the apartment floors. This is in an apartment bedroom. With the not too deep floor plate, there are some conditions, especially in the apartments, where we are using borrowed light from the outside windows. You can see on the right-hand side here, that's a sliding door, kind of an oversized sliding door out of one of the bedrooms that has translucent panels in it that lets natural light back to a little office area. This is the northeast corner of the building from one of the old office suites. Again, you can tell how constricted the view was looking out towards the old Huntington building. And this is what that looks like today with the larger window openings and one of the one-bedroom hotel suites. This Let's go through a few more interior shots here. Another view from the hotel lobby, reception desk. This is the presidential suite, again, on that northeast corner. One of the bathrooms in the hotel suites that has a little wet room condition with a shower and a tub combined. This is in one of the apartment suites. What I wanted to point out here is the building being so tight to the street. It's a really great vantage point. And on these suites that are on the north end, you can see all the way out to the lake, looking down 9th Street. You can see out to Playhouse Square. And then in the opposite direction, you can see back to Public Square. And in the very background there, you can see the Soldiers and Sailors Monument that I mentioned earlier. As the story goes, Levi Schofield kind of carefully planned that portion of the building to be able to get that view back to Public Square, which now some of the residents get to enjoy. It's the kitchen. This was the office area that I mentioned in the previous slide, that door opening to the left. So you get the borrowed light, and then the hallway that goes back along the bedroom to a bathroom serves a dual purpose as a little study office area that's accomplished through these built-ins. This just shows you in one of the apartment suites, again, that curveless shower detail that we were able to accomplish through cutting into the sleeper system. And this is the penthouse unit, one of the biggest units in the building, at the very top of the 14th floor. Right below that ceiling, or right above where that ceiling condition is where the cupola would have been on the building. Unfortunately, it was cost prohibitive to bring it back, but maybe someday. And the 3 biggest units at the top have fireplaces in them as well. This could be a whole nother talk about the significance of these types of buildings in the city. But we did think it was important to mention that these buildings really are community landmarks and how integrated they are with just the vitality of the city, the life of the city. This shot here is kind of the cover shot of the building being lit up at night. And I wanted to share with you here from the Cavs championship parade. Now, after working on this building for all these years, of course I was out of town on a business trip when this happened, but the whole time I was gone, everyone kept sending me photos of how they got to go up in the building and watch all this unfold. But again, I think it just shows how important these buildings are to the life of the city. And lastly, in summary, we hope, although we're not asking for more approvals, as I mentioned earlier, that Levi Schofield would approve. But we think we do. And I swear there is no Photoshop on it. But that's it. I mean, I do want to leave some time if there were any questions.
Good morning. I'll make this quick and easy. This is actually going to be an architect's slideshow, so I'm going to try to make it cool for you guys. So a little bit about you guys' companies.
What?
Okay, there we go. Here's this. All right, Geis Company started about 50 years ago by Katie and Erwin Geis. They were German immigrants who came to this country to find a better life for their family. What ended up happening is Erwin worked with his brother at a machine shop in Macedonia, Ohio, feeding the Chrysler plant there. And as their business started picking up, he had an idea of, building his own building to house this machine shop. Well, he went and found land, built a 6-unit, 3,000 square foot bay building, about 12 foot clear, all brick on all sides. and his brother decided that he wasn't going to move the machine shop, and then he was stuck with a building with no tenants in it. So they finally got into the real estate business and started leasing out the buildings, and then grew to what it is today. About 10 years ago, the Geist companies obviously grew. Fred and Greg Geist took over the company, and their vision at that time was, they spent a lot of years taking companies from the downtown Cleveland area out to the suburbs. So their vision was to bring it back downtown. And it all started with the whole Midtown complex down on East 55th and 64th area around there. And what came of that is all these different little companies that all feed up into the Geist companies. Geist Construction, Geist Development, which was formerly known as Hemingway Development, Geist Capital, GSL is the Architects, GDOT Design, Geist Properties, and Geist Hospitality. I show this slide because it's pretty key into the project of the 9. Right? The 9 was obviously the Prospect and Huron garages here, the P&H buildings where the Tyler County headquarters building sits, and what you know is the 9 today, which is the 1010 building, 900, and the Rotunda. Where the P&H buildings were sitting, actually we demoed those buildings, and we actually found the time vault that Ameritrust had buried on the site. And I brought some of the documents from the time vault out there, so on your way out by where the continuing ed forms are at, there's some old newspapers from the New York Times, Cleveland Press, Plain Dealer, and also some investor documents from the bank themselves. So feel free to look them on the way out. But as you can see, we have all these buildings. If you look on top where it says Tower at the M, that was the original name of this project. Then we found out that Marriott Hotels had copyright on the M, so we had to obviously change the name and change it to the 9. Obviously, if you're from Cleveland, you know a lot of the history about the building, so I'm not going to go too much into the historic value and what it means to the city and all that. This slide here shows a lot of the sources and uses for the project. As you can see, in the sources part, there was also probably 21 different lenders within those sources there. So very complex from a financial standpoint, with the total project being $263 million. To the right here is a stack plan of how we envision this property to look. Up at the top we have our mechanical systems and dog park, hotels and the apartments, and more apartments in the 1010 building, and then Rotunda where Heinz is currently today. One interesting thing about this stack plan, and part of the whole energy efficiency of the building is that this entire complex is wired with fiber optics. I don't know of any other building in the city that is truly fiber from coming into the building all the way up to either a hotel guest or a residence end plug-in. Okay? We are truly fiber. And the reason we went that way is because of all the systems that are in the building. We have a hotel system for reservations. We have a hotel lock system. We have hotel HVAC controls. You check in, the units kick on, everything goes. You also have the residential part of all these aspects. Then you have all the Ledger bars and all the bars and restaurants, all their point of sale stuff. All of this runs through the fiber network. And what that allowed us to do is typically on each floor you have an IDF closet. That closet would have, some kind of Cisco switch and a plug. So you bring all the data in and then it spreads out from there. But with fiber, we didn't need the plug, and then we also didn't need to cool the room. Okay, most IDF rooms have some kind of cooling, but when we went to all fiber, we didn't have to cool any of our rooms, so we saved air conditioning and electrical and actually switchgear for pretty much 28 floors of a high-rise building, plus the 1010 and the Rotunda building. So that is one of the major key factors is, in the operations standpoint, as to, how we built this building. We have an elevator system that runs through our fiber network. So if you haven't been in there, we have elevators, we have TV screens on them. And every day around 3:30 in the morning, all the elevators come to the second floor and the door is open. And what that does is it reboots the system for new content to go in for the next day. Right? And it's all automatic, it's all pre-programmed, but it all runs through this fiber network that runs through the building. HVAC controls run through this fiber network. Now, in the units, we have a wireless thermostat. And what that allows us to do, at least for the residential component of this, is that if a resident, say, is in his bedroom more times than he is out in the open area, we can just take the thermostat and move it in his bedroom so he has the temperature he wants in his bedroom versus outside. You know, you have sunlight coming in and the guy's sleeping and he gets frozen out because of the sunlight coming into the thermostat. So it gives us a lot of flexibility with the fiber network in the building. This gives you some of the project highlights during construction. Some of the key factors is there's 1,000+ construction jobs and the time frame of the project. We built the county headquarters, demoed buildings, built the county headquarters building, and did all the renovations to the 9 in 18 months. Now, a lot of people say, well, you know, at the time saying, no, you can't do it, it's not going to get done, it's not going to get done on time. We got it done on time, and the reason we got it on time is back to this initial slide of all these companies. So in our construction office, we had our construction managers, we had the ownership group, we had the architects, we had the engineers, we had, is what I'm part of the base properties. We're there. You know, we're there because we're the ones living with this at the end. So we had a lot of input into this project. But we were able to get this done because all of us were sitting kind of all in rows, you know, in our construction office. A few other highlights. The entire project was done with prevailing wage, and we had the entire building leased by the time we closed in March 28th. So all our residential units were 100% leased. Now the tenants were obviously weren't moved in at that time. We ended up actually moving in 20 tenants a week into the complex after this September 6th date. It was just nonstop, 3 different shifts every day of people moving in, moving in, moving in, moving in. So this is right here is a quick picture of what the 1010 building looked like inside. Obviously, like we saw in the Schofield building, a lot of deterioration, a lot of time. One thing about this project is I used to actually work for a company that used to own the building before we sold it to the county folks. So I was actually in the 9 when it was still an office building. So I was lucky enough to see it as an office building with money green carpet up on the 28th floor, the cafeterias in the basement. To see this transformation, you know, was just so exciting for me to see. And then, you know, the reason why, obviously, 10 years ago when they decided to come back